Welcome to the Cyclical Doula Podcast. I'm Emma, a certified Sympto-Pro instructor, a fertility awareness educator, and your guide to fertility coaching and reproductive health education from menarche to menopause and all the different types of motherhood in between. If you're seeking a natural, science-backed approach to managing your fertility, understanding your cycle, or simply connecting with your body in a new way, you're in the right place. Each episode is designed to empower you with the tools, knowledge, and confidence you need to thrive in your unique journey. Quick disclaimer, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice or individualized charting support. For specific guidance, please consult with your healthcare provider or fertility awareness instructor. Now, let's dive into today's topic.
Welcome to the space where cycles breathe, where the real raw life of Emmamma leads. From motherhood's highs to charting the low, your body's story is the star of the show. Matriarch heart.
Today, I'm talking with Dr. Ashley Hudson, a licensed therapist who works with women and couples from trying to conceive through postpartum. She brings together faith, evidence-based care, and a whole lot of compassion. We're unpacking purity culture today, what it is, how these messages show up in our bodies and relationships, and how to rewrite the script. We also talk about matrescence, think like adolescence, but for becoming a mother, why your brain and hormones may shift your erotic connection for a season, and why that can actually set you up for more satisfying intimacy long-term. Ashley shares an easy exercise called a sexual timeline, ways to start a calm, shame-free body conversation with kids, and why couples with flexible roles and open communication report higher sexual satisfaction. We even bust a few myths, yes, including that infamous 72-hour rule. And just a quick note before I get started, we do mention sex, faith, and postpartum mental health. Take care of yourself as you listen, especially if you have any littles around and that's not something that you're ready to talk about. All links, directories, book recommendations are going to be in the show notes. If this episode brings up any questions about charting your cycle, you can always find me at Cyclical Doula or book a free inquiry call at Emmamma.com/free. Are you ready to dive in? Let's get to it. Welcome back to the Cyclical Doula Podcast. I am really excited today to have Ashley with me. I'm going to have her introduce herself to kind of just get us started and learn more about where she's coming from.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Well, I'm Ashley. I am a licensed therapist and practice mental health, specifically working with the perinatal population. And that really spans any couple from trying to conceive or individual trying to conceive up through the postpartum season, which varies according to who you speak with. I'm usually working with folks with kiddos ages 0 to 10, but it really varies. And I got into that after my own experience with severe postpartum depression. And so this really became the sole focus of my practice for a long time. And I also happen to intersect a lot with faith communities. I'm a pretty outspoken Christian. And so because of that, just naturally rubbed shoulders with folks who were wanting more faith-informed like mental health services. And so I ended up serving in a lot of those spaces and just bringing more research-based information to them. And so as I was kind of working with couples, I started seeing just some struggles around sexuality and intimacy during the postpartum phase. And of course, for couples trying to conceive during that phase as well, for different reasons, obviously. And I found myself feeling like I needed more education and just needed a little bit more information in order to ethically provide the best services to my people. So I ended up going to get my PhD in clinical sexology and have finished that now. And my research really focused on the purity culture movement, which was kind of a movement in the late 90s, early 2000s. But through the program and obviously my own research, I learned so much about maternal health and sexual functioning. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. That's so good. I'm so excited to have you. I feel like we could probably talk for hours about all sorts of different things. But I think so. Before we get to dive into the topic a little bit more, I did want to ask, what is one like ritual or rhythm that you like rely on or like you constantly go back to in your own life? And that can be work related or in your personal life too.
One ritual. I actually heard you ask this to someone else in another podcast. I was like, oh, I should think of something. So I'm glad that I thought about it in advance. But I am a sucker for silence. I don't know.
Okay.
It's like I am a highly sensitive person, if you've ever heard of the HSP trait, and I
Yeah.
require so much sensory rest in order to feel centered and grounded. And
Mm,
that was something I've like known. I came from a family with 4 kids. Like I've known that about myself, that I really liked it when I was quiet and not touched, or like had just the right amount of pressure and soft clothes on, etc. But
right.
after becoming a mom, I was like, oh my gosh, no, I need
Mm,
silence. So I've actually worked into being inspired by my own mom, worked in rhythms of going away on silent retreats by myself,
nice.
into my like kind of quarterly rhythms. And that has been so important and life-giving for me. So it's not really like a daily ritual, obviously, but I do
Yeah,
find that
no, but
it
that's
can be
great.
quiet, but
I love
it's
that.
huge. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. What I think that's something that we don't often think about as human beings of so much of like that's a need for like you as an individual, but also then like you can find stuff like that, like a silent retreat, like a whole weekend or a
Yeah.
week, however long you're going, but just that time to be able to really take in that space for just you, which could be so great. So that's
Mm-hmm.
awesome. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. I love it too.
That's amazing. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you specifically today about purity culture. And I think the best thing to start off is probably many people have kind of like an idea of what purity culture, like what that phrase really means. But maybe you could explain what that means in regards to like the movement behind it, to start off, and then we can kind of dive a little bit deeper into what that looks like for people kind of coming through that.
Totally. So the purity culture movement, which my research to frame this up a little bit was on the impact of purity culture movement on postpartum women who engaged that movement. So there have been entire books written on the purity culture movement.
For
And
sure.
as you can imagine, there is a myriad of different ways that people define what that is. So the purity culture movement began in the late 90s, early 2000s. It wasn't the first movement of its kind, but it was the first time that this emerged in this way with access to different, marketing strategies and print, access to books and putting out materials in kind of a more organized fashion. And so we did see kind of an uptick in regulation and education around sexual health in like the 1920s, actually, during a syphilis outbreak. And in that time, it was like the social hygiene movement. And so
Right.
that kind of went out. And then we had this resurgence of this purity culture, kind of what we have come to call the purity culture movement in the late 90s, early 2000s, really in response to the AIDS epidemic, teen pregnancies. The country was really kind of speaking to US citizens, though purity culture really swept over the whole world pretty quickly.
Right.
We were really facing a crisis here in the US when it came to AIDS and teen pregnancies. And it was the government's attempt at kind of confronting this particular problem or crisis we were having. It happened to intersect with when the Southern Baptist Convention was going on, and they had been developing a curriculum called True Love Waits, kind of behind the scenes. One of the Lifeway publishing companies had been working on this curriculum, which was about sexual education in light of really kind of traditional Christian conservative doctrine. And so it had a lot of traditional gender scripts that went along with it, but it was also very centered on heterosexual marriage, heterosexual practices, and gendered scripts. So men tend to do this and want this, women tend to do this and want this. So it's very kind of structured in that way. And because the US was facing such a crisis, they ultimately ended up utilizing this True Love Waits curriculum, repackaging it, taking a lot of the faith content out of it, but at its core, keeping the components, like the outline of how to talk about sex, how to teach about sex. And so it was very rooted in a lot of fear. A lot of folks I talk with now have all the information about, not that they really remember it because they mostly dissociated, but about
Yeah.
STIs and like
Right.
what could go wrong. And not a ton of information on, pleasure informed, like, practices and how to
Right.
really be in tune with consent in their bodies. And does my body even want sex right now? I don't know. I didn't learn that. I didn't learn how to be in my body in the presence of a sexual,
Yeah.
encounters. So all that to say, this movement kind of swept through as they really released this abstinence only education program, which in schools is what that was called. And then in the church, it was called True Love Waits. And so that's what we call the purity culture movement. From there, you saw purity balls, you saw, purity rings, you saw all, modest is hottest shirts. There was a whole marketing campaign that went
Yeah.
along with this way of thinking. And so we also call it purity culture because of the way that marketing campaign infiltrated systems in a very covert fashion. And I
Right.
say covert, I mean, it is kind of overt. Like, these
Yeah.
people at these
Yep.
conferences did some pretty wild things that now you look back and you're like, wait, what? But that was really kind of the nature of the movement. And what we know now when we look at research is that it actually wasn't as effective as they had hoped. Not only did it not help with some outcomes like teen pregnancies, but it actually led to more risky sexual behaviors. So we saw a lot of people not utilizing, contraception appropriately, and just lack of information about consent, for instance. And there's a lot of correlation. I have a colleague who's done a lot of research on the correlations between rape myths and purity culture and how those overlap.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit about what the purity culture movement is. And I think we've all been touched by it in different ways, whether or not you come from an overt evangelical background or Catholic background. It is really infiltrated even within the public school system.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for taking the time to explain that, because I feel like that really kind of hits all of those points of understanding like where it came from. And it's not just religious based, but that it's really ingrained in a lot of education in general, specifically in the US. But you kind of mentioned that it kind of spilled over otherwise as well. So I think as you're talking about this, a lot of things have like come to mind of either things that I personally have experienced or things that like clients have experienced or just friends. And I think we could go in a bunch of different ways, but I think I would love to hear to start off talking about kind of how, if somebody's coming into their committed relationship, their marriage with this understanding, because a lot of us have, how do we start like unlearning that and like really figuring out how to dive into understanding ourselves, our bodies better?
Yeah, gosh, that's such a good question. And I'm glad you're asking it because so many people come into my office in the postpartum season and ask, like, now that they have a baby, they're suddenly present to like, oh no, I have to parent this child through sexual
Yeah.
development. What am I going to
Right.
do? And all of their own pain and questions and confusion comes up. And
Right.
so it's so important to consider this on the front end of even getting into a committed relationship, if that's your fancy, or,
Yeah.
be sexually active so that you can
Right.
enjoy
Yeah.
it.
In general. Yeah.
So I think first and foremost, something I do with my clients a lot is have them fill out a sexual timeline, which sounds really funny, but I literally have a timeline from birth to current day. And every little moment that you can remember, that you have any recollection of, or, season that you first discovered your genitals, first masturbated, first, encountered pornography or an erotic, art piece, first wet dream for some of the men I've worked with. So really put every little thing on this timeline. And then for each of these places, pause and ask yourself, what did I learn about my body? What did I learn about other people's bodies? And what did I learn about sex and sexuality? Because it's from that place where you can get really clear on kind of the underlying scripts that exist beneath your sexual functioning. For
Mhm.
so many people, especially those socialized within the purity culture, they learned early on silence gets translated to shame in a child's brain
Right.
usually.
For
And
sure.
for most people, they grew up with no education, complete silence, if not absence only. And so they initially felt a ton of shame around discovery of their genitals or discovery of a pleasure system. And because of that, they kept quiet. They didn't ask questions. If they did ask questions, they were often shamed. And it kind of further enhanced that. And our bodies are created to completely shut down or dissociate when we experience chronic, ongoing moments of shame. And so a lot of people's brains wired or associated together sexual arousal and I should leave my body, I should dissociate. And
Mm,
for some, that shows up as like, making a grocery list while they're trying to make love with their partner as a grown up.
right.
And, for others, it shows up different for everyone, using substances, et cetera. But you'll notice kind of going through this timeline will help us uproot some messages that might be contributing to that shame or anxiety that leads to dissociation, or that might prompt the system to, have racing thoughts or engage some sort of behavior or patterned thinking that is not going to help them experience pleasure, or that will inhibit, body confidence or whatever it is they're wanting to achieve. So that's where I
Yeah.
start with people when they come in.
That's
Mhm.
amazing. I love that. I think that's what a good way to kind of just like talk through and like think about, reflect on all of those points of learning. And I think like as a parent myself who's trying to change the script a little bit in regards to that, which you had mentioned, which I'd love to talk about as well. But that coming up of like, all right, like how can we change these conversations in the moment when they're 2 and 1 and 5 and 7, right? Like of like how are we having those conversations um to lessen that shame pattern that has been for a lot of people, their experience around sexuality and body literacy and things like that. And so that's
Mhm.
something that I've worked on a lot to try to get through and figure out how to do that. And I always come back to just like if you can just talk about like the specifics of like this is our anatomy, this is like the function of X, Y, and Z. That like that's a great spot to just start with all of that.
Yeah.
But how do you kind of what do you talk about with people, and how do you kind of frame that around then like teaching that to your children or to the next generation as well?
Yeah. And that's such a good question, because we our nervous systems are contagious, especially among kiddos that are
Right.
absorbing us and need us to co-regulate. And so they will pick up on anxiety. That's not to say if you've been anxious when trying to have a discussion with your kid about sex that you've ruined them for life. That is not true. Do not hear me say that.
Completely. Yeah, that
Um,
yeah.
I often will tell people, like, you look, when these kiddos are born, they don't really understand what you're saying. So this is a great time to practice. Practice
Absolutely.
keeping like a calm system while saying the word penis. Practice keeping a calm face while saying, I'm so glad you asked that. Or, whatever. It's not going to make sense to an infant, and that's okay. This is rehearsal. It's just dress rehearsal. And it will become more organic and natural as this kiddo grows up. I love Dr. Sellers is one of the people who are kind of out in this world writing on the subject, but from a purity culture history. And she
Yeah.
says you really only need to be 2 years ahead of where your kid's at developmentally when it
Right.
comes to
Yeah.
knowledge about sexuality and bodies. And so that can be really, that can feel really freeing to a lot of parents who suddenly feel this pressure to have it all figured out on day one, because you're not going
Yeah.
to. Every kiddo is different. Every kiddo is going to need something different. Everyone's going to start asking these, certain questions at different periods of time, and that's
For
okay.
sure.
So
Yeah.
really taking the pressure off and giving moms and dads, like all parents, just permission to like get it wrong. If you get it wrong, there's repair. Like kids are the most resilient. Their brains are completely plastic and, ever changing. And so getting in
Yep.
there and trying again is so important. And yeah, beginning with function is where we begin a lot of those conversations. And one thing I love about working with moms specifically, or parents, is is that there's a lot of, in the therapy space, we talk about reparenting. We kind of go inward and we work a lot on our inner kiddos. And there's so much opportunity to reparent oneself through these sexual conversations that either didn't happen or happened in a really poor, shaming manner, in a way that feels really liberating and really like powerful. And so a lot of, in my sample for my study I conducted, not one person was going to, actually no, one, I think, and even she was like a little on the fence, was going to continue providing sexual education in the way they received it. Everyone wanted to do something different.
Everyone wanted to do something different. Yeah. Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
That is really interesting. And were they coming from all different types of like backgrounds in regards to their own education?
They were all, yes, but they were all women who had been socialized in the purity culture movement or had engaged it in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. I think that's like, I was actually talking to my mom about this recently, just in general, like just learning around sexuality and around our bodies and around reproductive health and in general. And I feel like there's been a lot of growth of knowledge around women's health over the last 20 years or so. And I guess there really hasn't been much at all, but like it's been better. And I think like that's been something of like, it's as parents and passing that down to the next generation, like we're doing the best with the information that we have at the time, like that society has at the time, that research has at the time. And it's okay to like be like, all right, like I know that like this is what we've got now. And when our kids grow up to be adults, like there might be more education around all of that and they might learn something new that they can teach me too, right? Like I think that's such a cool, if you can look at that as that way as a parent, I feel like that can be really beneficial to kind of approach these conversations too, of like, they're going to learn something new as an adult as well.
They're going to have more information. Like you said, I mean, the clitoris was like not even fully mapped out until 2004, you know, like,
which is mind boggling to me.
It is, as it should be. It should be mind boggling to us. And yeah, even so my research really uncovered a lot of, I kind of grounded a lot of my findings in this concept of matrescence. Have you talked about matrescence on here?
No, but
okay. Matrescence is like this sociological term that it refers to becoming a mother. So just like we have adolescence where we're becoming a grown up developmentally, we have matrescence in which we're becoming a mother developmentally. And it's a process. It's not like this happens in the birthing space. And there's actually so many parallels neurologically that we now have brain scans of that show that the same regions that are being reformed and shaped and, you know, making a lot of growth during adolescence are actually also active during matrescence. We're renegotiating a lot of our identity and our roles and our relationship with people and who we are and what this means and what's our story and why. We're revisiting all of that, and all of that touches on our sexuality and sexual functioning in some way.
Yeah.
And so that was really powerful part of the research. And that, like you're saying, is new information that we're just now getting that my mom wouldn't have known about. She wouldn't have talked about that with me.
Right.
I can't wait to see what my daughter brings to the table one day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's amazing. What else about like your research stands out to you that like you feel like everybody should know in regards to what you learned and what people experience? Hey friend, quick pause before we keep going with today's episode. If you've been curious about learning to chart your cycle, but the whole thing feels just a little overwhelming, I made something just for you. It's my 14-day charting challenge. It's a completely free experience inside my private community. For 2 weeks, you'll have the opportunity to go through simple daily practices that will help you tune into your body's natural rhythms without pressure, without perfection, and without needing to know anything ahead of time. You'll get a chart to use, 3 short, confident building lessons, and a supportive space where you can actually start to understand what your body is showing you. It's all bite-sized and totally doable, even if life feels super full. So if you've been wanting to learn a fertility awareness-based method or just feel more connected to your cycle, come join us. You can sign up at the link in the show notes or going to my website, Emmamma.com, and clicking on the free treading challenge. All right, let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, gosh. Well, matrescence was a huge piece. I think normalizing the earthquake that is that experience inside,
Yep.
and the ways that hormones reshape the brain and our nervous system in order to care for young, and how that impacts, the erotic connection with a partner temporarily and reshapes it for the future is really important. The other piece that I found was that for couples who had ongoing open communication about sex and were willing to have cognitive flexibility, was this term that kept coming up.
Okay.
Meaning they were able to think differently or consider a belief from different angles without feeling like they were threatening the relationship or threatening some existential system, but being able to say, you know what, I've been thinking about this whole, being a homemaker thing, or, I've been thinking about this whole caregiving, like what if you helped with some diaper changes?
Right.
People who were getting more flexible with gender scripts in particular had the highest level of sexual satisfaction. So couples who were able to, in fact, one of the studies, the women who actually had jobs outside of the home and helped bring in income and were older, not younger, had highest levels of sexual satisfaction. And so a lot of what I was reading was, or what I was assessing through my analysis, I saw so many profound things. But I saw this beautiful kind of way that women were reclaiming agency and autonomy in their birthing process, in their birth plan, in their fertility, their reproductions, like their reproductive story overall. Being able to feel informed and in charge was a healing thing after, for many, there had been coercion, especially if it was systemic through the purity culture movement or, in a more abusive, smaller situation at home, or with a peer. So the birthing experience itself was such an embodied one that really required them to get in tune with their body. And they, through that, reclaimed all of this agency and presence. So they were able to experience, some of them experienced orgasms for the first time after becoming mothers, because they were able to be present in their bodies. And that was such a liberating and it was an experience where they found their power for the first time, and were able to actually own their bodies and their experience in their body, which even for those who had birth trauma was a profound experience for them that ended up kind of bleeding into their erotic space, because they finally felt like, oh, I can ask for what I want in the bedroom, like get out. And so it led to this like beautiful enhancement of sexual satisfaction for some.
That's amazing. What a cool finding. And I think that's a part of like becoming a mother that isn't talked about at all. And can be such a, like, what a cool experience to be able to say like, hey, like there's studies, there's research behind this, that this is actually taking place. And also like here, maybe even teaching for the next generation or like people who are becoming mothers now about like you can do this now even, and through that process, which would be so cool.
Yeah, 100%.
That's awesome. There's so many questions that I could ask you. I think I had somebody else ask me a question around purity culture that I guess would be a good thing to bring up. They were talking about the fact that they were raised in a household that for a multitude of reasons, they weren't allowed to like even like high five a guy because they thought that would bring up like sinful. Their dad specifically thought that would like cause sinful action. And we touched on this a little bit before, but I think there's like so much unlearning that especially women have experienced in this when they're brought up in that way. And then if they're choosing to be in a relationship and want to experience those sexual their sexuality and like understand their bodies better, it can be like a huge switch. And I like, for me specifically, like my experience was like kind of neutral on stuff to begin with, but then like the switch of specifically in like the Catholic culture of like don't have sex before you're married, like all of those things. And then the moment you get married, they're like, all right, like when are you having a baby? And you're like, well, you didn't teach me about my body. So like, how would I even know? But my question for you, because you've worked with a whole bunch of couples too, is how, there's probably not very many men listening to this, but how can men or partners in general kind of support their partners who, I guess it could go either way, right? So like whoever had the experience of living in this culture of, in this purity culture, or raising in that abstinent only education. And if the other partner hasn't, how do you connect that, and how do you have those conversations? What can they do to support?
Yeah. It's so hard because a partner really has to be willing to learn and be curious. And it also depends. So what I saw in my research with my participants was oftentimes those, even the men who were socialized predominantly in the purity culture movement, were not aware, because women and men were always separated for these discussions around bodies and intimacy and the erotic. And so men had no idea what women were hearing, and the women had no idea what the men were hearing. And there was also so much fear of disclosing what one another were hearing. And so because of that, you're right, we call it in our field, we call it the light switch moment, where you're supposed to go from on to off, or off to on rather. But within these dynamics, what I found was, okay, there was just this ridiculous, I have another colleague who's writing a paper on this right now, but there was this ridiculous rule that was taught to us called the 72-hour rule. And it said that for women, if you do not have sex with your partner every 72 hours, he will become angry, potentially abusive, and likely unfaithful and leave the family. And so one of the first things on my mind when I came to this research was because I was so upset and frustrated at all of these women who were in these environments, and they had a whole litter of children, and they were terrified because they had limited to no education, no ability to have money to pay for childcare. So they couldn't leave. They were trapped. And then the message they received was, I have to basically have sex with this person every 72 hours, or else he has the right to become violent with me and or the kids, or leave. And for a mother whose brain is wired to connect and keep their kids alive, they will choose sex. And many did, and came to me in that state. And that was devastating for me. In my research, what I found was a lot of these women, the ones who I was specifically looking at resiliency factors. So I wanted to see the women who had a great sex life despite all of this messaging. The ones who had a positive sex life were those that told their partners about, they had this like mental breakdown in the postpartum period, and were like, I'm so sorry, it's been 72 hours. And their partner, who was socialized in the same movement, said, what are you talking about? That is not a thing.
Oh, fascinating.
So it's really interesting the way these scripts were given. Another one was that like men were kind of painted as these wild, beastly animals without any self-control, and who would combust and get violent if they didn't, have sexual intercourse or any sort of sexual relief, which is a very vulnerable position as a woman to be put into a relationship with.
For sure.
And then for others, I work with some high drive women who have a higher drive than their husbands, and they feel like something is wrong with them, or their partner's broken because he's not this monster maniac. And so there were just these pictures painted. And I think so many folks coming out of the purity culture movement actually are deconstructing faith altogether, because they're like, the foundation of my life was built on this scheme, on this formula that doesn't make sense. And I did the thing, I did A plus B, and it didn't equal C. And I'm disappointed. So I'm throwing it all out and rebuilding some sort of faith framework. But, anyways, I don't even remember what the question is. I'm so sorry. I'm just like babbling on.
No, I think that's good. I think just like how partners can be supportive, which you kind of, you've touched on about
I think
Like
being
them just
curious,
having those conversations kind of
yeah, asking
can kind of
questions.
open up. Yeah.
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 And reading. I mean, some great books out there, The Great Sex Rescue, and She Deserves Better. And I would invite partners, specifically male partners, to read She Deserves Better, because that will give them a glimpse into how his wife or female partner was socialized and what pressure was put on her, and to be able to put himself in those shoes, if at all possible, would be a really powerful experience for him to better understand. Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. I'll put those in the show notes too, just so
Yeah.
that people can find those books. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, what do you think if you like could tell every woman something about their bodies, about their learning about all of this, what's like your one thing that you like always want to drive home to anybody that you work with or anybody that you connect with?
The one tagline I use all the time is, you make sense. You make sense. You're not broken usually. If something hurts, seek medical care.
Yeah.
But otherwise, you make sense, and you're beautiful, and you don't have to live into a script that is handed to you by society at large. You actually can define what motherhood is for you, what the erotic is for you. It doesn't have to look like you were told it has to look. Ask yourself whose voice that is in your head. But there's hope. I mean, the majority of my participants had better sex after kids for a variety of
Mm-hmm.
reasons, and there's a lot of data suggesting that's possible. But there's so much hope. Sex changes throughout the lifespan, and there's data saying the best sex happens in 50s and 60s. So like, this is a season, and not all
Yeah.
seasons are marked by wild monkey sex, as one of my mentors used to say. So I
Yeah.
think just radically accepting that and being super compassionate with yourself and your process is important.
That's great. Yeah, that could, I feel like, resonate with everybody. That's so good. So as we're talking about this, something has come to mind of,
Mhm.
because this was so ingrained and still is so ingrained in our education system about like abstinence only education around sexual health.
Mhm.
Do you know of, or like, are there movements to like educate in a different way and really try to change that as a system, like through the whole education system? And how can parents find that
Yes,
too?
things are really changing. I'll have to send you some links because it's
Okay.
not on the forefront. Like, I don't have it in front of me, but
Yeah,
I
that's totally
have a
fine. Yeah.
lot of resources. But things are absolutely changing, both for those who are coming at it from a faith perspective, who are really wanting, something that aligns with their specific theology or position on
Yeah.
matters, that is comprehensive, and I appreciate that. And then
Yeah.
there's there are other, that aren't faith affiliated and that are more kind of widely distributed, that I will be happy to kind of link to you.
That'd be
Yeah.
great. Awesome. So good. Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else that like comes to mind that you want to share? Any myths you want to bust? And then I'd love to ask you about like how people can work with you too.
Sure. Yeah. Gosh, I'm trying to think of the myths. I feel like we've covered so much good
Yeah,
territory,
we
so
have
it's
for
hard
sure.
to like
There might not be
suggest
anything
them.
else
It
specific.
might not. Yeah. I mean, well, I could talk for probably too long, 10 hours plus
Yeah.
on just this. I just wrote, 160 pages on it. But I think there's hope. Things can change and ebb and flow. And one of my suggestions as an application of my research and my dissertation was to include partners more
Yeah.
in information or informed care, not just around birth, but around fertility, around postpartum, around menopause, not just about, how babies are made, but
Right.
about pleasure and
Yeah.
the brain and mental health. All of these things work together. We're creatures that are, very complex and so I just think there's so much space for holistic healthcare, and I would love to see partners become more involved in some of those conversations with providers.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm all for that. I'm all for everybody being involved. That's so good. Okay, so can people, if people want to work with you, I know on your website you have like a couple different resources. I was poking around a little bit, but can people work with you from all over? And like, what does that look like? How can people connect with you specifically?
Yes. So that's a great question. My business is in the midst of kind of an expansion process. So
Awesome.
I don't have all the firm details yet. In
That's
fact,
fine.
we're even like, are we going to remain Pearl in Process? Are we going to change it to Ashley Hudson? What makes the most sense? But I
For
will
sure.
say I'm licensed in Colorado, North Carolina, and Texas for therapy services. And then I'm
Yep.
expanding to coaching, and we'll be providing coaching worldwide to
Awesome.
individuals and couples who are wanting that level of support around their intimate lives or mental health. So they can email me at ashley@pearlandprocess.com. I'm also on the socials. It is at Pearl and Process, which you can link to all of that.
For sure.
But those would probably be the best ways to reach out. And I anticipate having all of that really launched in January of 26.
Okay.
So hopefully I'm like in conversations with my attorney now. So hopefully that will be up and running by then. But
Awesome.
if not, reach out anyway. And I'm happy to connect you and make sure you have good support where you live.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, that was going to be my other question. Like, how does somebody find somebody like you? Do you know, is there like a specific way that somebody could find maybe a therapist that's licensed in their state if they want the same type of support, and what would they look for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if they are pregnant or postpartum, so I'm getting a phone call, so I'm going to turn that off. Okay. So yes, if they are pregnant or postpartum, I love Postpartum Support International, and they might even have resources for trying to conceive. I'm not sure. But if you go to PSI's directory and search for sex therapists, I don't know how many of us are out there, but I do know I'm on there. And I would like to imagine
there's at least a good handful. I've looked before. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a few out there. When you add in the faith component, sometimes it adds layers that are a little bit tricky. If people really want, specific approaches surrounding their faith system and beliefs. But that's where I would go. If you look at ASECT, I can send you that website. That's a directory for those of us who are ASECT certified. Just means that we're sex therapists who have been through a ton of training. But I'm actually dropping that particular organization because so many are being added to the universe right now. So there are a lot of different really good organizations. But my suggestion is always look up what's required to join any sort of association. Like how much education, how much supervision are these people getting? Because sex certified therapists, people anyone can say they're a sex therapist. You don't need to be a certified sex therapist, and to be in an organization that can verify that is really meaningful in this field, because people throw out terms all the time. So searching specifically for that is important.
Awesome. That's great. Perfect. I think that that's amazing. Those are so great. And I feel like I can imagine that this is like a lot of people's experience coming through this, and a lot of clients that I've worked with could really benefit from having these conversations more. It's been such a joy to talk with you. Is there anything else that you want to just like plug as we round out to this conversation?
I don't think so. Listeners, if they follow me on social, that's where I'll release, because I'll probably do some upcoming groups on rescripting sex and, some of my favorite little things. But I'm taking a breath after graduating to take.
Absolutely. As you should. That's great. I love that. Okay. Well, great. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing more about your research and just who you are.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for tuning into the Cyclical Doula Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean so much if you shared it with a friend or posted it on Instagram and tagged me at Cyclical Doula. If you've got a question you'd love to hear answered on the show, head over to emmamma.com/podcast to submit it. And don't forget, leaving a quick review really helps this podcast reach more people. Plus, if you upload a screenshot of your review on my website, I'll send you a special surprise as a thank you. You'll find all the details in the show notes about this show today, and I really appreciate you being here and listening in. I'll see you next time.
Welcome to the space where cycles breathe, where the real raw life of Emmamma leads. From motherhood's highs to charting the low, your body's story is the star of the show. Matriarch hearts, cycles that speak, charting the truth in every peak. This is the cyclical doula sound, where body wisdom is always found. Matriarch hearts, cycles that speak, charting the truth in every peak. This is the cyclical doula sound, where body wisdom is always found.
Just a disclaimer and a reminder that any guests on the show are views of their own and not necessarily views of Emmamma LLC or Emma Goff herself. Thanks so much.